to the Man Cave Classroom.
In A10. So we're going to start talking about the Industrial Revolution. So all that stuff you remember from westward expansion, particularly when it comes to maybe, I don't know, innovations of the railroad, I want you to keep that in your head because that's what we're going to get into today and then moving forward, because I think the best way to approach the Industrial Revolution is we're going to get into the railroads itself. Now this is your favorite topic.
One of.
What is it about this topic? Go ahead.
You know,
This is a big day for you, big moment.
it is. It's progress, really. You know, I start off by talking about like defining revolution. And of course you got like the science kid in the back of it. It's like, it's when the earth goes around the sun.
True.
I'm like, yeah, technically, but
Okay.
not in the historical context.
No, not even.
You know, and then like, it's a war. And I'm like, why do you think that? Well, they're like French Revolution, American Revolution.
Yeah.
I go, yeah, well, it could be a war, but it's to change. You know, and change happens in different ways. Like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, it's instantaneous. With the stroke of a pen, we were independent from Great Britain. Where it comes to the Industrial Revolution, it's this long, slow process that takes place over a course of about 100 years, really, you know, of the Industrial Revolution. So the question is really what's changing during the Industrial Revolution?
I'm glad we stopped here and messed around with this word here because, you know, prior to the 1900s, when you're hearing revolution, it's usually, you know, fighting or going against. And of course, you're going to see that in the 1900s, but, you know, when we're looking at revolting, you know, it's going to be drastic change. It's
Right.
going to be, you know, members of a society that might be revolting or even rebelling. You know, rebel is, of course, revolution's sister word, you know, if you
Yeah.
want to get to it. So I'm glad we went that way. So, but we're going to look at the railroads, all right? So, you know, 2020, you know, we have all these different modes of transportation. We have airplanes, we still have trains, but the thing is that if you're going to go from state to state or from country to country, you're going to do it in a plane. Of course, during this particular time period, as I brought up country to country, you know, you're probably going to be talking about a ship, especially if you're going over to Europe or over into the Pacific. So when it comes to the Industrial Revolution, some of the things, these words that we're going to kind of get into throughout this unit, factories, migration, capital, money. This unit is very interesting. You could spend an entire semester or a lifetime talking about the Industrial Revolution, which is, we're only going to really get a tip of the iceberg. But the thing that catches my eye with this, when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and we're looking at steel, you don't really get too much of it into the Civil War, but we start to see steel being used in the Civil War, and it's starting to change warfare. And you get hints of that during the Civil War when you're looking at ships, and you have the classic battle where they don't know if it was really a win or a loss between the USS Merrimack and the Monitor. So you're going to start to see something like steel change naval warfare.
And I like that you were bringing up the Civil War in the first place.
Yeah.
Because teaching 8th grade social studies, I find one of the most difficult parts about it is because the way the topics are set up, it's not chronological.
No.
So it's like,
It's like they're all taking place
yes,
at the
we taught Reconstruction, Civil War
Right.
Reconstruction, then Western. Now the kids are like, wait a minute, why are we going back to the Civil War?
Right.
And the Civil War is like the like halftime of American history.
Pretty much.
You know, because the Industrial Revolution starts long before the Civil War. And it was progressing up until the Civil War. And we get out to the Civil War, and like the Industrial Revolution was kind of like halftime and took like a 4-year pause. There wasn't much progress as far as industry goes during the Civil War. After the Civil War, however, that's why I kind of teach it like it's the Industrial Revolution Part 2. You know, the post-Civil War Industrial
And it is kind of cool because when you're looking at the first 5 chapters, it gets kind of confusing. It's like a story where there's other stories going on. It's like, meanwhile, out west.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in the cities.
Yes.
Meanwhile, on the farms. You know, if it was a reality show, it would have 7 different characters, maybe.
Yes.
But when we talk about steel, you're going to start to see a changing naval warfare. We talked about in westward expansion how trains are going to get us going from the East Coast to the West Coast. It's going to make travel much more easier, efficient, cheaper, safer. There you go. So when we talk about trains, again, we have 2 maps here, and then we're going to put them side by side. And really what we have here, if memory serves me correct, right? When you're looking here, this is right around, you know, the 1860s, okay?
Just before the Civil War.
Just before the Civil War. So our red is going to represent roads. The blue there is going to represent your canals, and then these tick marks within here are going to be your rail lines. You with me so far? So far, so
Gotcha.
good. So we got red, roads, blue, canals,
Roads, we're going.
and then
we
railroad
need
lines.
Roads.
Okay, you with me? Good. Let's see what happens now. Now these red, all of this is going to represent rail lines.
We are now in 1880.
Now in
just
1880.
20 years later.
So with this new innovation, if we're putting these side by side, and one of the things that they like to do is that, what can we conclude then from these two maps?
Well, one of the things, if we can just focus on this map for a second,
Yeah, sure.
my kids are like, Mr. Kogan, how come the North had a lot more railroads than the South by 1880?
Good one.
And then my question back to them is, what was our first unit of study this year? They're like, oh, Reconstruction.
Right.
Right, while the South's really literally trying to rebuild from the ruin of the Civil War, the North is having this boom of railroad mileage, with really Chicago becoming like the
hub,
capital, the
yeah.
hub
Yep.
of the railroad industry. We have our transcontinental railroad, of course.
And keep in mind too, your canals that are over here that were really responsible for a large part of the shipping and the early get going, they're also in the north here.
Yep.
So, yep, perfect.
And they were great, the canals, but, it's almost like the toll booth collector.
Right.
They came and they went.
Right.
Because now we got Easy Pass.
Limitations.
Yeah.
I mean, really, when you're looking here, it has its limitations. It can't necessarily go from coast to coast. I mean, it can. It's going to take a lot of work to kind of make that happen. But, and the thing is that you're bringing up canals, and a particular person we get into in this chapter is that Cornelius Vanderbilt. He started off with canals. He was in the shipping industry, and then
He had the forethought to see, this
Exactly.
isn't going to last much longer. I'm going to go onto that iron horse.
Similar, if you're looking at the video industry or movie industry, when you're looking at having that thought that Mr. Kogan was just bringing up to kind of evolve with the times. Once upon a time, you'll hear us say this throughout the year, there was a place where you used to have to go to rent videos. And then when streaming services like Netflix came along, they pretty much put those places out of business. Now, had video stores, been able to think forward and maybe have enough capital, I guess, to kind of get into the streaming world.
Blockbuster had the capital,
They
they
did.
had the technology,
That's right.
they had the clientele who would have easily switched over, but they didn't have the forethought to change.
Evolve or die, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the business world. So if we want to make any conclusions here, rail line is going to become the way of shipping and traveling.
Particularly in the North.
Yep. I mean, of course, today, what's the way of travel? Airplane.
Car.
Yeah, car. Now, when we look at these network of rails then, which is pretty interesting, when we look at these, many rail lines were short. Passengers reach the end of one line, they'd have to go from one to another. I think if you've had trains before, this could be very helpful to you today.
Oh,
So
my-
if we're looking
this
here,
was-
when you get from one point to the other, you'd have to get off and get onto another train.
What's everybody's favorite train?
Don't say Thomas.
Oh, yes.
No,
There he
no,
is.
God.
Everybody's favorite choo-choo train.
Oh, man.
I remember
Can't stand him.
my son Sean, who's now actually in 8th grade, he's 13 years old now.
Right.
When he was a kid, he loved Thomas the Tank Engine.
Right.
And it was like his second birthday. And my mom is like, what should I get him? I'm like, get him something for Thomas the Tank Engine. And it's like, great. And if you ever played with Thomas, you know that Thomas's tracks are those wooden tracks.
Yeah.
Right? And they connect together and they're great. They're actually, I got to admit, I'll go to like Barnes and Noble every now and then,
Okay.
and we'll go play with the trains, even as a 42-year-old man. Just kidding. Just kidding. I
He's
love
48.
trains. No, I'm not. So my mom goes out and she buys the Thomas tracks. Is this Thomas?
It is Thomas,
It's
but
Thomas.
there is an issue with the tracks.
How do I explain this to a 2-year-old who wants his tracks to connect?
How do you explain it? I would say carefully.
Yeah.
Or maybe here,
It's like-
you'd have to
It's
go.
now what am I getting at here? I'm getting at that this was the problem our country faced.
With rail lines.
Because of all of these rail lines that are being built throughout our country, all of these rail lines did not have a set type of track. It kind of looked like this.
Yeah,
You
pretty
know,
much.
some were 5 feet apart, some were 2 feet apart, some were 2.5 feet apart. Why is that going to matter?
Well, you're not going to be able to, go from one train to the other. Now, it's funny. I was spacing out, and I just had a thought. And I don't know if you know this, or I would have to say we'd have to draw a conclusion here, all right? Because when we're talking about building all of these rail lines, everything, if you recall, you had a lot of these companies that were getting subsidies,
Mhm.
land grants and money. But of course, they're not gonna give you something, go take your time. So there was time was of the essence. You needed to get this done. So I would probably say they didn't have the time to sit down and go, you know what, let's make this work.
Yeah, or
I would probably have to say that.
now it's an exaggeration to say one was 5 feet, one was 2
Right.
feet. But if one was 2 feet 1 inch, and the next one was 2 feet
They're not gonna
2
connect.
inches, they're not going to connect.
gonna connect.
So you have a railroad. It's like a hard word.
Yeah, I got you.
The railroad going from, let's say, New York to Philadelphia. Great. But once you got to Philadelphia, you had a different width of the track. So if I'm shipping apples from New York to Philly, but I really need to get them from Philly to Baltimore, now we have to unload that entire train of apples, switch them over to another train that's on the smaller track or on the larger track.
And of course, if I'm shipping those apples, all right, and I'm paying a particular price to do that, if I have to have 6 dudes take it from one train and put it onto another,
Exactly.
guess what happens to the shipping cost? It goes up because you have to factor in that you're paying dudes to unload it.
I tell my students, I'm like, all right, we've all been on the Long Island Railroad. How many of us have ever had to transfer at Jamaica?
Right.
Every single hand goes up. Is that a big deal? No. You put your coat on, you grab whatever backpack you have, you walk
Not a big
across the
deal.
track, not a big deal.
Because they're passenger trains.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you had 45 tons
Yeah.
of shipping goods, now we got a major problem.
Right.
And if it's if it's a perishable like apples,
Right.
now you're gonna like rot the apples out.
So even though we started off by saying, for example, something like the Transcontinental Railroad, or the railroad in general, makes things, easier, much more efficient and cheaper, yeah, it did initially, but, just like we're kind of pointing out to you, not everything was perfect when it first rolled out. The whole rail lines, the gauges being different widths, and I just lost it, the gauges being different widths is gonna create a problem. And here you have what we were just talking about.
It's called breaking the gauge.
Yeah, exactly.
When you literally have to unload everything from one train and put it on the other train. Where if everything was the same width, that train could just keep going.
Yeah. I believe in the cell phone world, they might actually refer to this as something where everything is connected, if that's gonna be your solution.
Oh, the most reliable network.
Network, right.
A network.
So if you have everything connected here, right, much more elaborate, that was the goal here. Now you're having a network here. I stole this from you though, this is part of your network with your TikTok.
social network.
Ah, the connected, oh, good,
Yeah,
that was nice.
Yeah, you've got InstaChat,
InstaChat, yep,
Snapgram.
Snapgram, Facebook, but that's for old people.
Yeah.
So is LinkedIn, LinkedIn's for old people.
I didn't even know what that was. That's for like business people.
I have one.
Really?
Yeah, I just want to keep track of stuff I do. All right, so your network, this is going to be the solution to it. So, it's real simple when you're looking at this in front of you. So I think that's how we would explain to Mr. Kogan's son, what seems to be the problem here. Well, you put the tracks there and you kind of like, let him kind of work it out on his own. So what's the solution? Well, what you do is that you make the gauges the same width, right? Which is pretty much here. That was what their solution was. So it's going to benefit shippers because that's going to bring the price down of shipping
Because you're going faster.
because you're going to be going faster.
It's easier. That same faster, easier.
Yep.
I believe it was Congress that authorized the mandating the gauge be a particular width. I forget the act. I'll have to.
And I'm
look
sure
that
it's
up.
tied into the Interstate Commerce
Commerce.
Act. I'm sure with that. All right. So we'll get into how we're going to improve rail travel. So think about airplanes and what they do to win over customers, and we'll think about that and apply that to trains in our next session. Thanks for watching.